This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
About the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center. For more than 25 years, artist Carrie Mae Weems has given us a glimpse into issues of domesticity and intimacy in Black life. She joins us today on Left to Black, talking about her work. And later we're joined by Professor Thabiti Lewis, professor at Washington State University in English, to talk about his new book, Ballers of the New School. This is Left to Black, and I'm Mark Anthony Neal. You're watching Left to Black, and I'm Mark Anthony Neal, and we are honored today to have in our Left to Black studios the fabulous artist, Carrie Mae Weems. How are you doing today?
I'm fine.
Thank you for agreeing to sit down and talk to us for a little while. You're here visiting Duke, giving a talk this evening, or rather in conversation with the art historian, Richard J. Powell, showing some video.
I think so.
And of course, you've been kind of in the minds of folks here at Duke and the Nasher, your piece that's in the record exhibit. This kind of gold album piece, a photo of yourself. Recalls Dee Dee Bridgewater, maybe Dee Dee Sharp Gamble, I mean, all these figures. So it's great to have you here to talk a little bit more about your work. I probably first got to know your work with a piece that's almost synonymous with you, the Kitchen Table series, going back to 1990, and these still photographs centered around the experiences of a Black woman going through the kind of changing paces and places of her life, but while sitting still at the kitchen table. Talk a little bit about that work. What were you hoping to achieve with it? And it just opened at the Art Institute in Chicago, so that there's clearly a kind of timeless quality to it that 20 years later, more than 20 years later.
More than 20 years later.
It still resonates. What do you think is the power of the resonance of that particular series, going forward now for more than 20 years?
Well, there's no doubt in my mind that Kitchen Table was a breakthrough piece for me. And I think if I can be bold, because I'm really interested in sort of ideas about invention and how African Americans invent, it was a breakthrough moment in invention in relationship to another kind of way in which photography could be used in order to tell a more complicated and deep story about life. Not only in terms of sort of complicating notions of representation, but also sort of complicating notions of narrative, and using both those things together to create a third way, a third path. So I think that in many ways, one of the reasons that it's so enduring is because it manages to do to tell this very sort of personal, universal story that appeals to people across race, class, and gender, and it also manages to do that by stretching the conventions of contemporary photography, which is, and so for me, that's really the thing that's really interesting and dynamic about Kitchen Table.
I mean, one of the things I think that's so compelling about that particular series, I don't think we ever describe images as having brevity, but there's a certain kind of brevity about the images, right?
What do you mean?
Sparse. I mean, they're
There's
not a whole lot going on, but yet the images are still saying a great deal.
That's right. That's right. It's very stripped down. Yeah. It's very stripped down. And the only thing that you see, for the most part, the woman never moves. Yeah. She's always in the same place, and so she remains the constant. There is a kind of light of interrogation. Yeah. I call it a light of interrogation over that space, that kitchen table, where any number of people are allowed to interact with her at any given moment. you know, or she's allowed to interact with herself. The most important thing is that those sort of entities are so culturally marked and so culturally significant that we understand its meaning, which is the reason that we can sort of strip it down. We don't have to have food. We don't have to have. Right? This is a table. Right? And its title, its language carries also another message, the Kitchen Table series. So every culture in the world has something around table, around food, around kitchen. Yeah. It is the beginning and the end of all major conversation.
And yet there's
not
still,
the bedroom.
You know, there are still all these powerful things that I think that the kitchen table invokes. I mean, I think about kitchen table press. You know, the black feminist press from the 1980s, the idea that the kitchen table would be this space where black women would be allowed to think through, you know, their place in the world. I think about all those great kitchen table images in Charles Burnett's film, Kill of Sheep, you know, where black men, and we always think about it as a very domesticated space, but I think you're asking us, you know, in that series really to think beyond.
Well, you know, that's sort of an interesting point, because it is sort of thinking beyond, because ultimately what happens, you know, this is not a happy story. Right. You know, this is really sort of a critique of family and critique of monogamy, sort of questioning the role of the relationship of women to men and to women to children. Right. So that it really sort of unpacks a great deal of material in a very compressed space. There are only 15 photographs. Right. There are only maybe 12 to 15 pieces of text, I think. So that sort of way of working has been very important to me, whether it's in the Kitchen Table series or something like From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried, which compresses this sort of enormous amount of sort of social history, cultural history, and political history in 20 photographs, in 20 pieces of very sparse and minimal text. So it's a way somehow I've managed to learn to work that I think has been very important for my way of imagining and thinking through work and my own sort of philosophy in relationship to how economy is used in the making of anything.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by the great artist Carrie Mae Weems. I want to go forward 20 years. A more recent exhibition.
I'm starting to sound very old.
Well,
Let's go now 40 years ago, 20 years ago.
But slow fade to black, and I want to, in fact, read this quote, interview that you did with Dawood Bey, talking about the invisibility of black women, and you say this invisibility, this erasure, out of the complex history of our time, our life and time, is the greatest source of my longing. And so Slow Fade to Black presents, you know, all these images of black women, icons. And I know my own viewing of the work online, as I'm seeing kind of the blurred edges of the pictures, I kept expecting the pictures to come into focus. I mean, that was the impulse.
That's
like,
fabulous.
when is it? It's like, exactly. Is there some sort of digital process? Is it going to come into focus? And it never really does. And what you're experiencing then is really this historical erasure, right? You know, there are folks, myself, you know, who can look at the symbols of an Eartha Kitt, of a Dorothy Dandridge, and know, well, yeah, I know that's Pearl Bailey. I mean, all those kinds of things. But, you know, as we go forward, you know, folks are not going to be as literate in the images of those icons.
Isn't it interesting?
Yeah,
it's a really interesting piece. It's a really interesting piece, and I think really represents my own deep crisis around what is happening to us and not happening to us, and that we are at this deep sort of precarious moment. Will we solidify? Will we solidify? Will we emerge? Will we emerge? Yeah. You know, or will we sort of be subsumed by the complicated powers of our time that refuses to recognize our possibility? And so it is the question for me of our time? What's happening to us? How do I continue to make imagery in face of this crises that I think that we are experiencing, even while we have a black president in the White House, even at this sort of moment where I thought that perhaps it may represent a change in the American imagination. Yet when I look across the cultural landscape, no matter where I look, there are fewer and fewer and fewer representations of African Americans that are meaningful and deep and complex. That is a great concern to me. So how do I continue to make a work? What is my practice now? What are the kinds of questions that I should be asking of myself and of my audience, regardless of who they are, about this cultural positioning that we find ourselves in?
I mean, there are some folks who will say there is a wider diversity of black images that can be consumed in 2011. Right?
Oh, really?
But I think you're making a critical point about, when we look at the mainstream of American life.
Absolutely.
And even in some ways, that even, for the first family Baraka, in some ways become such an imposing presence within that mainstream that it's them and nothing else. Within that context.
There is nothing on primetime television that, for instance, represents a representation of a complicated blackness, not in any stretch of the imagination. And I think that that's really sort of bizarre. If in contemporary publications, the same thing is true. Here and there, of course. There is, I think we are sort of entering, though, another kind of interesting moment of representation where absolutely certain powers that be understand the significance of marketing to a broad strata of the society, so that you're beginning to see Asians and blacks and whites in the same sort of commercials, that sort of thing.
Multicultural space.
Yes. So perhaps there will be some sort of significant breakthroughs here and there. But I do think that and I was talking with Professor Powell about this morning, the economy around blackness is absolutely significant, and it's important to the extent that things are published, to the extent that things are written about, to the extent that books are published and publications are made and exhibitions are held. All of that, is about a certain kind of economy. Will a book around blackness sell? And to what degree will it sell? Right. Well, we know that for the most part, 90% of all those things that sell have a blonde on the cover.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's just like advertising.
Yeah, right.
Do you know what I mean? So if we know that that's true, then how do we sell the black image?
Right. I mean, the conversation we've heard over and over again, mainstream magazines, the difficulty, their sales going down when there's blackness on the cover, right?
Fascinating.
And so we've only seen literally one or two black women who show up over a 10-year period of time. Within that context.
Yes. I mean, and this poses, I think, a really interesting question. And other ways of working too. I mean, it really starts to beg the question of what are the, with new and contemporary technologies, what are the other ways then that we sort of circumvent the system? But we know that we are actually still operating from the edges, for the most part.
And it's interesting because if we think about blackness only in terms of, say, hip hop, and youth culture, the perception is that blackness is in fact pervasive in the culture. But once we broaden our scope to think, more broadly about,
Well, even that's of course changing too. I mean, it's Eminem actually who's, really up for the Emmy this year. In hip hop, you know what I mean? It's Justin Timberlake who's like really taken over. I mean, this is very interesting. This is very interesting. I do remember, a particular time when I was invited to Time Warner to talk about the effects of hip hop music, and I was there with all of these men in business suits. I mean, these men, these white men who looked absolutely the same. They were all like the corporate heads of every division, major division at Time Warner, and they were asking me what they thought that their social responsibility should be in regards to hip hop. I thought this is really fascinating. You tell me. You're the one that you're making $10 billion this year.
Right. Yeah.
You know, what do you think your responsibility should be? So, but this is very interesting that has changed, and there's something, of course, again, very exciting about that, because it means that there are these boundaries that are being sort of crossed, right? Interesting boundaries that are being, you know, really broken down, and at the same time, we also know what it also means too for African Americans, that once again they're sort of displaced from their own inventions.
Yes. That's a great way to describe it. You're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're here with Carrie Mae Weems.
Artist extraordinaire.
Yes, artist extraordinaire. If I was...
That's on my stationery. We thought that we just might as well mess with people. Artist extraordinaire. Yeah.
If I were driving around the city of Syracuse now, you know, where you live, you know, part of the time, there are all these billboards.
You've seen my billboard project.
Around Carrie Mae Weems and Social Studies 101, Operation Activate. And it's your response using public art to gun violence. And many of these photographs are just really striking.
Did you think so?
Yeah, the one where, you know, particularly where you juxtapose black militancy.
Isn't that fabulous?
Right, and the use of violence vis-a-vis just being a thug and violence, right? And using a gun, right, doesn't make you a man, it makes you a criminal. And they, you know, what struck me about them is that it's public art, but it really does function that way. I mean, it really just cuts to the chase, right? This is what gun violence means, right? The pictures of all of these black and Latino women, you know, who are menless, right? Their sons, their husbands, their brothers, their father, they're no longer there either because they've been victims of gun violence, right? Or they've been incarcerated because, you know, they produce gun violence. Talk a little bit about how that project came together.
Well, you know, I've really been thinking about, of course, for a long time, what's happening with our communities, what's happening with gun violence or violence generally in our communities, the deterioration of our communities, the deterioration of homes in urban communities, the abandonedness within the community, the lack of grocery stores, the lack of...
and fresh food if there is a grocery store, right?
Right, just this collapsing structure, the collapsing structure of the black community has just torn at my heart for a long time. And so a couple of months ago, I do a class at Syracuse University occasionally, at Syracuse University, called Art and Civic Dialogue, which I'm doing this year with David Ross, the extraordinary David Ross, who was at the Whitney for a number of years and at other institutions as well. But David Ross and I are doing a class right now on Art and Civic Dialogue. And I didn't think that I was going to be working on this project right away, but one morning, a couple of months ago, right, sometime in November, a child was killed. A 20-month-old baby was killed in the midst of this shootout between these rival boys. Yeah. And it just was too much. It came on the heels of a whole slew of shootings and violence and senselessness.
And this is not New York. This is not Brooklyn. This is not South Central LA. This is Syracuse.
This is Syracuse, and basically it's sort of every abandoned urban community across the country.
De-industrialized,
you know? Yeah. And so I thought that, you know, that it just simply got me up. I thought, okay, so now, you know, I know how to do a great deal, a lot of stuff, a great deal of stuff, and very easily and very quickly, because I've been working in the arts for any number of years now, as you know. And so I decided that I needed to, first of all, that I needed to have like a very direct conversation with the perpetuators of violence in my community, that I need to have that conversation, that this violence, that this recklessness will no longer be tolerated. And so I went out and I had signs made and I had them up, and people came out of their houses and said, please put one in my yard. Can I help you put one up? Can we put one up over here? Let's take one over there to that corner. And so suddenly my community, in a small way, was simply activated. Yeah. It was simply activated. So then I thought, okay, now we need to have billboards, we need to have signs, we need to have posters, we need to have flyers, we need to have matchbook covers, we need to have cocktail napkins that go into bars, we need fans that go into churches, we need billboards that go around the perimeter, not only of the city, but through the community as well, to simply activate the entire space.
Now, were you able to partner with the municipality?
Well, no, I am not partnering with anyone.
Okay.
I decided that it would be much more important to simply speak out, as opposed to waiting for some group of people to sanction what I was doing or to give me money for what I was doing. But what I also found out was that it was only a couple of $100s anyway.
Wow.
Right? It was okay, wait a minute, wait. It's a couple of $100s to have like a billboard in my city? That's kind of fabulous. That's kind of fabulous.
It'd be amazing to think to reproduce that, various artists bringing their own kind of take to, whether it's someone like Hank Willis Thomas or right, to be able to do that in their own, homes. Right,
absolutely. And so I have actually asked a group of artists, since I know everybody, to participate along with me. And other people have written me who've seen my blog and my website and who've read about this project to figure out how to do things in their own community, in places like Chicago, in places like DC. So this sort of little grassroots effort. This grassroots effort, not unlike, not even close, but not unlike also the sort of amazing thing that's unfolding in Egypt. Right? That there is a will and a need to change, and there's a will and a need to address what's going on in our communities across a number of different platforms. And this little idea of taking a billboard and making some posters have given people some pause, and they're saying, oh, wait, this is doable.
They've been up for a relatively short time. What has been the reaction?
Well, it's been really kind of amazing. As I said, people across the country have been writing me. The people in my neighborhood and throughout the community are very excited about it. Again, I'm sort of hitting on several different levels. On the one hand, I knew that I needed to speak with, to address the perpetrators of violence, the victims of violence. But I also needed to talk to the community as well about our responsibility to our community. That nobody else is going to come in here and solve this for us. This is really, it's not simply an internal problem, right? It's not simply an internal problem, but there is something about pride of community that really matters. And that once lawlessness has really taken hold, that represents something that's going on in the breakdown of the community. So that needs to be addressed. So I thought that I would really need to talk to both the citizens, the perpetrators, and also those young people that are trying to figure out a way of moving through. What are the sort of other ways in which they might begin to think about their lives? In the end, of course, we know that it's joblessness that is really the most systematic way in which one experiences self-pain. That if you don't have a job, then you figure out the economy based on what you can figure out. And usually that has a lot to do with the illegal and the illicit, and drugs then play a huge part. So the question, I think, of unemployment becomes a significant problem to be dealt with, really, in relationship to these communities. But this is nonetheless, I think, an important start. An intervention, yes.
You've done a recent piece, Constructing History.
Oh, yes.
And I was really struck by the collaborative aspect of it. These art students down in Savannah, working with you to take these critical moments around violence and trauma and tragedy in the 1960s and having them recreate those moments as art. And again, even going back to our conversation a few minutes ago about Fade the Black, they know all these stories, but they don't really have an intimate relationship with that history. And that the piece seems like it forces them to be intimate.
Yes,
you know,
yes,
with the murder of a JFK, the striking piece around the murders of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers.
The assassination. I mean, it seemed to me that in order to really sort of talk about the moment in which we've arrived at, you know, 2008 when the peace was made, that, you know, that allows Barack Obama and a Hillary Clinton to be even running for the presidency, seriously, in a viable way, right? That we needed to talk about the history that would allow them to be in that position at all, and that essentially that history is based on a series of tragedies, you know, and a series of assassinations that had taken place that so gripped this country. And so this collaboration was to bring together a group of people, some students from Savannah, yes, from SCAD, but also people from the Atlanta community, since I was making the piece there, and involve them in the making of this of these moments, the recreation of these moments that would allow us to understand something about ourselves in relationship to history and to the present. What is it called? Present tense, past perfect. You know, sort of looking at this, and it's been a really wonderful way for me to work. But I think in some ways, a lot of the work that I make is really based on these sort of these recreations. The work is very performative. You know, whether it's kitchen table. I didn't know that I was performing, but they're performative pieces. Roaming is a performative piece. The museum series, it's a performative piece. Italian Dreams, they're all deeply, deeply performative. And I think that there's something about using my own skin to know the experience of not only myself, but my imaginings that becomes very important to being able to sympathize. It's the way in which I understand the nature of compassion by putting myself in that position. By putting myself in your shoes allows me to experience something that's larger than myself.
You've been watching Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're here with artist extraordinaire, Carrie Mae Weems, who is visiting us here a few days here at Duke University. Thank you very much for sitting in with us on Left to Black.
You're welcome. Thank you. It's lovely to meet you.
Thank you. Take care.
Peace.
Good afternoon. You're watching Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're here with Professor Thabiti Lewis, Associate Professor of English at the University of Washington State University, at Vancouver, and he's the author of the new book, Ballers of the New School, Race, Sports in America, published by Third World Press. How you doing this afternoon, BT?
What's up, Mark? What's up? I am doing outstanding. I'm doing outstanding. Honored to be on this program, and so just doing well,
This new book is very provocative, but of course, race and sports is always provocative conversation. You know, fodder for the blogosphere, you know, fodder for, you know, sports talk radio, you know, even mainstream pundits, you know, find a way to comment around this issue of race and sports. Particularly, we're talking about folks like LeBron James and Michael Vick. Talk a little bit about the book, Ballers of the New School. Where'd the title come from?
You know, it's funny. The title came from the fact that I was moving too slow a few years ago. It was supposed to be New Jack Athlete. And my man wrote the book,
New Jack Jocks.
That's right. And I was so upset. And so just kind of thinking and talking a little bit. And so I started really reflecting on how, particularly in this contemporary generation, you know, kind of really, you know, I'm a literature guy, so kind of playing with this whole hip hop baller language and saying, you know what, let's really look at what does it mean to be a baller, but also looking at this particular generation of athletes as a sort of new jack and saying, you know, what does that particular athlete, what kind of challenges does it present to contemporary America? and American sports culture, and how does this particular post-civil rights generation athlete, this baller athlete, if you will, what kind of problems does it present for American culture, if you will, and particularly those sports writers who I think are, pretty much used to, I don't know, 3 or 4 decades ago. They're looking for, Babe Ruth. They're looking for the athletes from their grandfathers and fathers. And the response is really a response to them, is a response to, I think quite, in their minds, indignant or belligerent black folk or non-whites or, contemporary athletes. I would say mostly people of color who haven't accepted what their place is supposed to be.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, I'm playing with this whole idea of, kind of ballers, and the sense of, being, living life fabulously, being in control, calling shots. And I'm attempting to say, hold up, let's really look at what that means. And so, I kind of outlined the book looking at, there's a tradition that exists of a certain consciousness and activism, a certain commitment and purpose, a certain intellectual development, and as well as saying, understand what it really means to be a baller, and that's a certain longevity. I mean, Mark, you're a baller. You're a person who is, interested in and willing to step outside of constructed boundaries and saying, I'm gonna create my space, and I'm gonna do it by using my intellectual acumen and all my other skills, and in ways that, that I can kind of control the narrative and, who I am and how I'm functioning. And so, so on one hand, it is an attempt to articulate what this generation is, why it's being responded to in a particular way, and then also saying to this generation, wait a minute, before you, there was Jack Johnson, there was Kurt Flood, there was Althea Gibson, there was, this kind of deal, and saying, so, and then also saying, I understand the obstacles that are faced. Now, I take on sport because it is this sort of, it has historically been a normalizing agent within, American immigrants, but beyond that, it is this sort of centrist thing, if you will. You can get on the elevator with an old white guy, and if he's a Boston Red Sox fan and you happen to be in Boston, the cat might start talking to you. You guys will have a great conversation. So it shows you the potential. My problem is what I'm trying to do is say, we need to continue that conversation once we get off the elevator. Let's get to really know each other and let's get beyond surface. So I see sport as this, it's my vehicle, and I've been saying it everywhere I go, my vehicle to saying, how do we move toward the post-race that people, want? And, the first step is we have to really get into the messy conversations. And since the conversation, because people don't want to talk about race, I'm using sport as my vehicle to drive people to the conversation. And then once I drive everybody there, say, okay, now let's look at where we are in 21st century America by looking at sport culture as a microcosm of where we, what the real challenges, the progress, et cetera. And so I'm trying to challenge that sort of sport as this sort of, the most progressive arena in which racial progress has taken place in America, where people say Jackie Robinson did more for, American racial progress than Martin Luther King. You're like, whoa. And so I have a section where I'm going, well, let's look at the economic ramifications around, Jackie Robinson even, being able to play, with the Brooklyn Dodgers.
What was the stimulus for that, right?
The stimulus, which is economics. And I kind of show, look at their attendance before he came and when he got signed, and, so Branch Rickey is, as is the case with, he's a nice liberal cat, but, it's all about the Benjamins. Right. So, which is why I got sections going from, talking about big pimping in college sports to all about the Benjamins, and, some provocative titles for the different chapters.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're here with Professor Thabiti Lewis, the author of the new book, Ballers of the New School, Race and Sports in America. In the postcode of the book, you talk about, what you kind of deem one of the inspirations for the book. You're driving from St. Louis to Kansas City a few years ago, looking for the National Negro Baseball Museum, and literally driving past it several times, because it's just really just a storefront. And it's an interesting conversation because it speaks to the one hand on the hypervisibility of some black athletes, but the invisibility of the whole tradition and legacy of black athletics in this country.
Yes. Mark, this book did come out of that particular trip. I had no idea what the dynamics of this book was going to be, other than I was going to the Negro League Museum to check it out. And it was going to be the impetus of me doing some fact gathering and trying to figure out how I was going to approach, writing this book, whatever this book was going to be. And, that anecdote that I give, you're right on. It's this notion of this sort of invisibility of that particular history, and this idea of how, quite frankly, particularly in the late 20th century, the narratives around race have been, taken over by the right to the point where that the reality of the dynamics are very much invisible. And so just like me getting out of that car, I'm saying, okay, we got to get out the car and literally go find the storefront, which is that conversation and that history, and take a look at it. And, I know there are people, some pundits out there who go, oh, the Negro Leagues is nothing to really talk a lot about, make a big deal about. But, man, that is the Negro League Museum is very, it's very historical. And it teaches us and where we are and what we need to do, which is remember. And I think it's quite funny. But at the end of this month, I'm going to be there talking about this book, because it was the inception of it was at that location.
Location, yeah.
Yeah.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're here with the author of Ballers of the New School, Race and Sports in America, Professor Thabiti Lewis of Washington State University. You get that mistake a lot? Folks kind of mixing up UW and Washington State.
Hey, if they could pay me the UW money,
You start the book off in a different kind of mode, an open letter to your nephew. And you talk about, giving him a basketball a few years earlier and schooling him, right? And as you well know, basketball courts have been really interesting and unique spaces, I think, for masculinity in general, but in particular black masculinity, because it's never just about a game. No. It's never about one-on-one. It's never about 5-on-5. It's never about 21. It's about articulating our sense of ourselves, trash talking, but also a space to have almost intimate conversations that black men rarely have, outside of those kind of spaces. And so you take this opportunity to write this letter to your nephew. And one of the great lines I love is, when you say to him, I want you to refuse to perish.
Yes.
And you use sport as just kind of a life metaphor. Can you talk a little bit about your nephew, your relationship with him, and why it was important to begin the book with an open letter to him?
Yeah, and actually, this is my younger cousin, but the relationship is along those lines, right? Very close to my uncle, who had very much enormous impact on raising me, his dad. And so, number one, I begin with this because it's a book. This book is a hard book, I think, for many people. And so part of my thinking was I need to start in a way that people understand the very emotional and impassioned person that I am. The fact that, I'm not just writing this piece because I'm angry, but more or less disappointed in myself, our generation. What have we done, that we have a generation of young people who, quite frankly, feel as though for them, there's a certain nihilism where they feel, they're reciting bigs. You either have a wicked jump shot or, or you slinging a crack rock as a way of, upward mobility. And so, here's a kid who his parents are middle class. He's brilliant, and he makes his high school basketball team, and suddenly decides, as he's grappling with trying to navigate masculinity, that, I'm cool, I'm hip, sports is the thing. And he goes from being an honor roll student, never getting less than an A, to, languishing. And his parents, who are very much involved in his life, my aunt calls me and says, you got to talk to him. And it was at that point I started writing this, just a letter to him. And so for the book itself, I realized, I said, there's just a portion of that letter to him. And I'm going to go back for a second. Part of that line is somewhat influenced by James Baldwin, from, My Dungeon Shook and his letter to his nephew, to be quite frank. And I'm very open in saying, I'm very much inspired by Baldwin in this kind of sense. But, I just wanted to, as I was writing to him, I realized that my conversation wasn't just to him, but it was also to many other young men and women whose situation aren't even as bad as his, but we live in a society that this is a thing. This is where we'll invest our time as opposed to intellectual development. And so I was writing the letter in a response to his decision to abandon intellectualism, and also writing the letter as a protest against American anti-intellectualism. Okay, and attempting to to really kind of say, let's kind of look at this thing and see how we can redirect the purpose and vision, particularly of our young people, man. And if those who have middle class parents and have some who have some opportunities kind of decide that this is the direction, we're in real trouble. Yeah. And so that was a large part of the impetus as well.
I'm often struck, both my daughters are competitive swimmers. My oldest daughter is a very good competitive swimmer, and the difficulty to getting the community, to support. Here they are on a swim team that is about half African American, very unique swim team, as swim teams go, and particularly here in North Carolina. And it's very difficult to get community folks to support their efforts. But yet, when you see the kind of, intramural basketball program at the YMCA, you can't get parking at the YMCA, because grandma and grandpa and aunts are driving from 2 towns away. It's, as you mentioned, it is this kind of catch-22, and it's one thing for kids who are impoverished, who can almost only dream of using athletics, as a way to get out, right? I mean, we know what the history of that is. But I think, as you point out, it almost borders on tragic when you have kids who literally can think themselves, into the future, who feel that the only way that they can articulate themselves is through their bodies. And I'll use that as a segue into, as you talk about this new generation of ballers, and you make this interesting comparison between old school ballers, the Jack Johnsons, the Ali, Satchel Paige, a figure that I love, Althea Gibson. I think about Tommy Smith and John Carlos for the political piece. And then you compare them to folks like LeBron and Mike Vick and Venus and Serena. But you also bring Myron Rolle into this conversation. And not enough folks know about Myron. Here he is, a top tier collegiate football player at FSU, Florida State University, and he's a Rhodes Scholar, right? The first significant Rhodes Scholar in in college football in more than 2 decades. That's at right. FSU, no less, right?
Yeah, FSU, tier 1,
football factory.
That's right.
And here this cat is, excelling on the field, but also, even more so, intellectually. And I don't think the culture has any way to even talk about a figure like Myron Rolle.
Yeah, and there should be more, focus on him. And I was so upset, but I also got lucky because the book took a little while to come back out. And so I was able to tread back and kind of say, man, he got drafted by the Tennessee Titans, but he didn't make the final cut. But he is my hero. Yeah. He epitomizes what it means to be a baller. In that he is controlling his space, right? We know how hip hop, this idea of, controlling. He's controlling his space in the sense that he made the decision, I'm going to pursue this Rhodes Scholarship. Right. And then I'm going to work out while I'm abroad, and then I'll come back and, take a shot at the league.
And the funny thing, Thabiti, is that, David Robinson gets celebrated for doing that in terms of his military service. Right. Because we can recognize that in a certain kind of way, but we don't recognize Myron Rolle in that same context.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate. And don't try and goad me into getting into jingoism, Mark, in sports. I'm notorious for going to athletic events and I don't stand. And partly it's intellectual in me just trying to say, what are people, who's going to bother me? But more than that, just kind of making the statement of, anyway, I don't want to take you off into that, but what is the place of this, patriotism in sport when they say it's supposed to be an apolitical space? Right. Is what they teach our young ballers anyway. Hey, be apolitical and you'll be okay. But that's it transitions me to, this is really my real, what I'm really saying is that if we can look at sport culture and use it as this sort of measuring stick of how far we actually are not. And what I mean by that is the iconic figures that get the most notoriety and sort of mainstream access are those who are willing to imbibe a race-neutral persona, right? And so if that is the case in the 21st century, what does that tell us about where we are? No one asked Brett Favre to be race neutral. He's just cool. No one asked.
Don't even ask him to be Mississippi neutral.
He's a good old boy. He's everyday. And so again, this sort of normalizing of whiteness, and that he's a regular guy, and but by the same token, if I have to be palatable, if I have to come off in a way that is, somehow unthreatening, I don't know how I become threatening. I'm 5'6", and But anyway, if that is the criteria, then what does it say? And so I'm very hard, man, on looking at the power of, and I'm kind of moving around a bit, but sort of really taking on the journalists who I think are the most powerful writers in our society, because so many people read sport,
right,
and they read the narratives that are spun by these individuals, which is one reason why I applaud the efforts of Morehouse and Spike Lee, and trying to get more of these brothers involved. I love, if they're out there, I love to work with these people, to push these efforts forward. These things are really, really very serious, and so I'm on a crusade, Mark, man. This book is not just about talking about and explaining contemporary athletes, but it's about really trying to engage a movement against anti-intellectualism, moving discussions around race forward, and really being critical and saying, can we reclaim our athletes of color who are in these high-profile sports and generating money, to say, there's where you've come from, and what is missing around all the polities, right?
You mentioned Warrick Dunn, right, in the book, as someone who recognizes his responsibility, in that context.
Yeah, and Mark, let me say something else, man. This book is interesting because the struggle of getting it out. I initially was with Nebraska Press, and it was a real philosophical and political struggle to get this book out because, you had these mixed reviewers back and forth. I mean, you want to talk about vetting. This is a book that's been vetted beyond vetting. I really want to tell a story because it's about, if we're serious about liberation and what we're trying to do, you can't go to certain people and ask them to produce work that is going to perhaps be counterintuitive to what they're about. And so...
And let me pick up on that for a bit, because, it's one of the things I did wanted to ask you about the book. Here you are, for lack of a better way to describe it, we're all kind of mainstream academics. And there are obviously pressures within academia for us to publish certain places, to do certain kind of work, to have that work look a certain kind of way. And I think you made a very brave decision here. First of all, you were going to write a book that was going to be as accessible, right? That was going to make the kind of critical and theoretical analysis that it needed to make, but that your cousin could read, on a basic kind of level. Yeah. And then when the traditional avenues don't open themselves up, to choose to publish with Third World Press, just strikes me as like an extraordinary move, but one that I get the sense from you that was born out of necessity.
Born out of necessity, and also, you have to talk what you have to walk what you talk, right? So I can't talk about being a baller and pushing a spirit of, working with Black business and community in efforts to, to make a difference, and then, going somewhere else with the work. Third World Press has a tradition of these kind of, of works, and so, I brought it back home.
Right. 40 years, right? 40-year tradition. Yeah.
Over 40 years, and so my position was, quite frankly, how can I talk about and challenge people being a baller if I'm not going to be a baller? And a baller is someone who does step outside of the norm and says, I'm going to do it this way. And you're right, Mark. People are like, Thabiti, are you sure you want to write this book first? Don't you want to finish the Tony K projects that you have? And are you sure you don't want to just, do what they say at the University Press and, and you'll be all right? And my thing is, I just said, which is my personality. No, I'm gonna do it this way. I'm gonna do it this way. You know, I'm gonna live and die by my integrity. And you know, and that has to be. Hopefully, people hearing this kind of story says, you know what, I'm gonna support this book.
Right.
Let's see what this brother's about.
Right.
You know, if he's willing, he's courageous enough to write a book like this and take it through this press. I mean, Thorough Press books have won a few American Book Awards, you know. So, you know, and so, you know, and also saying, hey, we can do it different ways, you know, you can do it different ways.
Different models. And a quick shout to Hakeem Abudi, by the way.
Yeah, without a doubt, my brother Hakeem. Yes, yes.
You're watching Left to Black. We're here with Professor Thabiti Lewis, author of Ballers of the New School, Race and Sports in America. He teaches at Washington State University at Vancouver. I want to ask you a couple more quick things. One of the chapters really talks about this idea of what black leadership in professional sports looks like. And you mentioned this idea of a race-neutral presence. And immediately my mind thinks about someone like Mike Tomlin and also Raheem Morris. Here you have two head coaches in the NFL. You know, Mike Tomlin is the youngest, right? Even before you get to the fact that he's the black coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers, he's the youngest coach in football history to win a Super Bowl.
Right.
Youngest coach, and almost two, right? Youngest to go to 2 Super Bowls, right? He's 37 years old. You know, Omar Epps jokes aside.
Right. I know, right?
And then you look at Raheem Morris, right? Who's 34 years old, right? And non-traditional route, you know, playing for Hofstra of all places, you know, not going through any of the football factories, and lo and behold, he's, you know, coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And the thing that strikes me about both of these figures, and I think it's very different than Tony Dungy, right? Tony Dungy, for all of his success and groundbreaking that he was, you could always tell that Tony Dungy was calculating his performance, and dare I say, to make people feel comfortable about his presence. When you see Tomlin, when you see Raheem Morris, you have two young hip-hop generation black men who are just comfortable being who they are. And you know, and the reality is that, you know, neither one of them get hired without the Rooney Rule. And the whole point of the Rooney Rule was that you had, you know, this group of folks who were comfortable with folks who looked like them, who talked like them, who thought like them, and black men were always seen to be outside of that. And then you have these two come in and find success by just being who they are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I will certainly say that these people like Tomlin and Morris stand on the shoulders of people like Tony Dungy, who has endured Dennis Green, you know, these cats who have endured a certain, you know, kind of, and Dennis Green is kind of ballerific in the sense that he's doing it his way, and he's going to be who he is, and he's going to, you know, have his success. And, you know, Tony has his own style. But the reason I said Tony first is just because all of these cats come off Tony's tree.
Right. He hired them.
Tomlin, Morris, Lovey.
Right. He puts them on his staff. Right.
You know, all these cats. What's my man that was the coach of the Jets? You know, all these.
Herm Edwards,
Edwards. So, you know, quite honestly, the Rooney Rule aside is really the Dungy Rule, you know, to be quite honest. And he played it just right, which is what our forefathers do. He's like, okay, I'm going to just hang in here. I'm not going to talk a lot about the fact that I'm hiring these cats. And he's bringing these young brothers along, and there they are. And you're right, Tomlin, Morris, they're doing it their way. The majority of the players in the league look like them. They connect. Right. You know, always think about when you see the success of Tomlin, Morris, Lovey, these guys, Caldwell. Right. You know, you say, I think about the move. I have a chapter that does sport film. Right. And I think about Any Given Sunday when the Al Pacino character is trying to sit next to the young Mike Vick, I guess, quarterback on the plane, and he wants to talk to him. And he's like, yeah, I got great tapes. He's like, no, we do CDs. You know, we're not doing records and tapes. You know, and he's like, I'm listening to Trick Daddy. You know, and he's like, I don't do jazz. But this whole idea that they're connecting. So there is a cultural connection. There's a connection that allows a certain fluid respect.
Right, generational, right?
Generational. And, you know, the thing to me is that what I laugh about is that what it shows you is that, you know, we see if these were white cats doing well, everybody'd be trying to get them one of them. Yeah. But, you know, Tomlin has been the 2 Super Bowl. Caldwell has been the 1. Lovey has been the 1. In the last 4 years, you've had at least 3 black coaches representing, you know, taking teams, you know, to the Super Bowl, and a couple of them winning, and maybe 5. And so you think that the league would be
looking for them, right?
50% black.
Mining the NCAA,
exactly,
right? Yeah.
Exactly. But, you know, they don't exist. And I mean, not that they don't exist. They aren't getting these opportunities. And so these are the kind of things I keep throwing out. And that's the reason why I also interviewed the head of the Black Coaches Association, because he was saying to Thabiti, think about this, man. You have all of these historically black colleges that have athletic directors, coaches, et cetera. So they run around saying, oh, we can't find people who qualify. And he's going, well, these people have been coaching and doing this for years. Just come look. Right. So, you know, what we all know on our universities and beyond, diversity and opportunity is about intent. That's the number one thing. You just have to have intent to start out and create a space that is not hostile. Right, so that people can be successful. But you know, so those are anyway. I'll just shut up. You asked a component, I think, around them.
Before I let you go, let's talk a little bit about the University of Rochester. And I think there's such a great story to be told about the generation of y'all, you know, who were at the University of Rochester in the late 1980s. So we're talking about yourself. We're talking about Bakari Kitwana. We're talking about Tracy Sharpley Whiting, you know, who, of course, director of Black Studies at Vanderbilt. We're talking about Scott Brown. I mean, what's it like? What was it like? I mean, were you imagining at the University of Rochester 25 years ago, 25 years ago, that all of you would go on to these significant careers as thinkers, as academics, as writers, you know, et cetera?
Well, you know, it all started back then, man. It was a special place. It was a special environment. I think that we were, you know, it's unfortunate universities aren't the way they were then, where they would, you know, take, you know, non-middle class cats like us and bring them into those spaces. Where we would create pure hell, quite frankly. But it was a magical place, because there was a commitment. And for the upperclassmen to mentor the lowerclassmen that started a few generations even before us. So if you were a junior, you knew your job was to cultivate a freshman coming along and make sure that they were not just doing well as a student, but that they were, you know, our term back then was heavy. How heavy could you be? Have you know, so someone might start talking, Mark, and they would say, wait a minute, hold up, brother. Have you read this, that, the other? And then if you hadn't, you had to back out. But, you know, we had a real serious, and this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying being a baller. This idea of intellectualism was really an important thing. And so, you know, we had collectives where, you know, every Friday we were meeting in a space and having discussions around, you know, the works of Fanon, or it may be the philosopher Khalil Gibran. It might be reading poetry. It might be, I mean, but it was a consistent sort of intellectual engagement.
And stuff you weren't getting in the classroom. I mean, that's the critical, right? Some of the spaces you had to create for yourself.
And the university had just forced Frederick Douglass Center to come into place. And it's still a center, unfortunately, and not a program. And, you know, but I will say that we had some dynamic instructors who were postdocs, and as well as the history instructors there, people like Tiffany Patterson, who is now at Vanderbilt. And, you know, I got to work with, now that I reflect, people like Joseph Inikere, who is the ultimate, you know, kind of, you know, person regarding, you know, Atlantic slave trade, and Elias Mandela. And so it was, I mean, you know, Eugene Genovese was on the campus. So, you know, the university had some real dynamics going on. And, you know, part of the deal was not just, you know, taking those classes, but we were serious about who was really, you know, coming up with, the challenge was who was coming up with something, you know, beyond that no one had thought about, you know, and this was an undergraduate, which we didn't realize we were being trained to be graduate students. You know, so it was and you're right, Mark, I didn't really, we talk about it in passing, but that was a dynamic atmosphere.
I could imagine.
And I'm still a little brother in that whole group. I'm still trying to get a little more respect within that whole group now.
You've been watching Left of Black, and we've been blessed this afternoon to be joined by Thabiti Lewis, author of Ballers of the New School, Race and Sports in America. He is a professor at Washington State University, associate professor of English there. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Mark, it has been a pleasure, man. This wasn't even an interview. This was just a wonderful conversation.
This is barbershop talk, right?
So yeah, it was my pleasure completely.
Take care, bro.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.